All right. Well, with
Hi
that,
everyone, good evening.
hello, hello.
Hello.
Good afternoon, evening, morning to you, depending on where you're at. Uh, hello everybody. My name is Cole Worley. I am the creative director at Leader Games and the co-owner of Whirly Gig Games, and I'm a proud member of the Zenobia board. I was also a mentor during Zenobia One, and so I've taken a lot of designers through this process before, and have taught little courses on game design all over the place. And so what I'd like to do is kind of give everybody the short introductory lecture that I wish I could give every single person who I encounter at a con who pitches a game to me for some reason. Um, I always wish I could kind of take them back to the very beginning of the game and impart just a little bit of wisdom and a few guidelines and some things that they can use to measure their own progress and hopefully get through this whole process without unraveling. I think we've got some feedback. Okay, look, looks like it's been fixed. Thank you. Okay, so if you're on the call, you are being recorded. This kind of short seminar will be posted on a Zenobia YouTube channel in the coming weeks. I also want to mention that this is hopefully the first of several workshops. We have a big list that we're working on the back end. I'll be doing at least one more. We have subjects on, working on solo modes, on asymmetric design, all kinds of stuff. We'll be posting a schedule of those hopefully within the next few weeks as they get underway. So basically, here's how I want to conduct this talk. The talk basically has two parts. I want to talk a little bit about the iterative loop, and then I want to spend, in good iterative loop fashion, the second part of my talk talking about the iterative loop a second time in deeper detail. As I go through this, I'm going to be trying to offer some basic tools that I think everybody should be having on hand, as well as some guidelines, some kind of guiding lights that you can use to take you through the process. Now, over the course of the talk, if there is a pressing concern that you have, I'm happy to take questions during the talk. But of course, you're welcome to save them for the end. I imagine that I'm going to talk to you all for 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of room for questions kind of during the second part. Okay, so first of all, let's start right at the beginning. Congratulations to everybody for getting your project so far. It is no small thing to put in the work that you've done. But you have built excellent concept proposals. You haven't built excellent games yet. And the next stage of this contest is profoundly different than the stage that you've gotten to already. I have, in the process of Zenobia 1, I read amazing concept proposals that never materialized as games. And I played lovely games that didn't seem like they'd work from their concept proposal. So the concept proposal is no guarantee. But what have you made with this concept proposal? Well, you've given yourself a home base. You've given yourself a guiding light and a place you can always seek shelter in, and that cannot be undervalued. There is something else, though, that I want to make sure everybody has at this point, which is as you're thinking about the project you want to be making, it's worth remembering or writing down, if this isn't in your concept proposal, your personal goals for the project, specifically in the context of what games you might admire. Maybe, part of your desire to work on this project is something, you were inspired by Matt Leacock's Pandemic or his more recent Daybreak. You want to make a cooperative game that inspires people the way those games inspire people. Or you might find yourself in a very different position of not knowing any game that is anything like the product you're working on. That's okay too. It's worth thinking about the games that you don't like, the reasons why games haven't worked for you, and to kind of define your efforts in opposition to things that exist. But I do think it's worth taking this little moment right before we start really jumping into the process of design to identify our kind of guiding lights, either what we're trying to sail towards or what we're trying to sail away from. And that's a good thing to kind of append to your concept summary, just as a personal note. If you might say, like, look, I love the excitement of Kinesia's Raw, which is an auction game, or I love the feeling of playing a game of Monopoly with my family growing up. I want a game that creates that same kind of feeling. That sort of like little personal statement of intent, which is a little outside the scope of a concept proposal. It's a very helpful thing to note now as we get ready to sort of jump into the next stage. And as I talk a little bit about the iterative process, you're going to find me coming back to that touchdown. So I just wanted to mention it right now. Okay, so let's start with our first time around the iterative loop. Now, building a game is not like building a house or even writing a paper. It's something else entirely. Some of you might have backgrounds in design and are familiar with the concept of the iterative loop, but I'm going to here present it explicitly in the context of games and in its simplest form. So the iterative loop is basically an idea, a process that we use to build things. And it has several stages. The very first stage is to think about the design of the game, right? You have to formulate the basic design of the game and conceptualize it in some way that you can actually view and understand it. Now, what do I mean when I say the game? Well, the game is going to be two things fundamentally. It's going to be a set of components and a set of rules. Now, you don't need finely rendered components. You don't need finely rendered rules at this point, but you do need to be able to manifest your game somehow. So the very first stage of the iterative loop, kind of the top of the circle, that's design. Okay, so once you've done design, you move to the process of testing. You test your game, however many times you'd like to test it, and then after you are through testing the game, you move to the third step of the iterative loop, which is the analysis of the test. All right, so we started with design, we went to playtesting, and now we're at analysis. That analysis is going to lead us to more design. And so the iterative loop repeats itself. Now, the critical thing to understand about design is that design is not a straight path. You're not climbing up a mountain. You're riding your bike around a racetrack. You need to go around this iterative loop dozens and dozens and dozens of times. So what I'd like you to think about when it comes to this are two general principles when it comes to understanding how the iterative loop works. The first principle is you should do everything in your power to keep your iterative loops short. So I'll give you an example of this. Let's say you have a card game that has 150 cards. You're going to need 150 cards to capture this specific historical moment. If you have to redesign all of those cards before you can do your next playtest, it's going to take you a long time to ride your bike around that loop. But if you can take a smaller portion of your game and just design those cards, you're going to be able to get through that loop faster. So everything you can do to keep your iterative loop tight is going to allow you to go around it more than once. And ultimately, this is not about how far you've ridden your bike, it's about how many laps you've made. And I cannot overestimate that. It's also worth noting this doesn't just have to do with the size and scope of a project. It's also possible to think about the size of an iterative loop in terms of workflow. So for instance, if you are new at graphic design, layout is very expensive. So any time that you spend laying things out is going to take a lot of your effort and energy. Time where you want to be designing or testing is going to be spent on YouTube looking at tutorials to how to use Adobe Illustrator. You would be better off just using a pencil and paper because you can get through those iterations and kind of save layout for a little bit later in the process. So as you go through the iterative loop, if you find certain things are taking a long time, just keep an eye, observe your own process and look for ways that you can kind of make yourself a little bit more efficient and by constricting that loop. So that's principle one. Principle two of good iteration is to always be honest with yourself. Now this seems so dumb, so silly to tell a bunch of designers that you need to be honest with yourself. But you have to know that when you're working in the trenches of design, it is so easy to be dishonest with yourself, because you're the only one who is tracking how many laps you've gone around. And this is especially true when it comes to handling playtest feedback. So we all want to believe that we're sort of great designers on the cusp of being discovered. We all want to think that a thought that we had in the shower that morning is going to be the essential thing that fixes our game. It is very easy to fall into a confirmation bias when you're in a test, for example, and to think that this new change is fixing something. We'll talk a lot more about testing in a little bit. This is especially hard when it comes to a test where there are fellow designers or friends, a supportive community of testers. Supportive testers are amazing. They're a wonderful resource, but they want you to succeed and they want to build you up so badly that they're not as good of readers of your game as you are. So it's very important to maintain your own critical eye throughout the entire process and be completely honest about what is and isn't working. Now, to that end, when I mentioned at the very beginning about those guiding lights, I want to flesh that out a little bit more. When you start your project, you should take that concept proposal and put it in some kind of document. This document is going to be like your design journal. And the concept proposal essentially is that the first chapter of your design journal. And then right after the concept proposal, you can talk about those guiding lights. You can be like, look, I'm trying to make a game that is as accessible as Ticket to Ride, or is as funny as a party game I love, or whatever. And then in that same area, I think it's also often very helpful to list out a list of moments that you would like your game to create. Now, those can be moments around the table that is describing the players at play. They could also be moments that are happening within your simulation, right? I'm doing a game about the Reformation, and I want a moment when King Henry has to ask the Pope for a divorce. And you can ask yourself later, did my game create that moment? Or did it not? And so you can make a list. I would say pick five. Pick five essential narrative beats that you want your game to create. And then as you are working on your game, you can go back to that list and you can say, okay, my game is always delivering thing one. It's not really delivering thing two. Find ways of holding yourself accountable, because it's very easy to lose focus in terms of your critical eye as you get deeper and deeper to a project. And anybody who's ever conducted a long-scale project knows that when you get halfway through it, you think, well, maybe the first half of the book is the full book, and you can just stop here. It's a very common thing. Okay, so to repeat just quickly, the iterative loop is the process that we're going to use to make a game. And making a game is not like climbing a mountain. It's like going around a racetrack. And it doesn't matter how long the racetrack is, it matters how many laps you go on. So by making that racetrack small, you're able to more effectively iterate. The steps of iteration are design, testing, analysis, and then back to design. That's it. And in fact, if you look up the iterative loop, this isn't like an idea that I made up, it's a very common idea. If you look it up in Google Images or anything, you will find dozens of iterative loops. Some have got 12 steps, some have got 3 steps, but they all boil down to that very, very simple framework. All right. Now, let's talk about the iterative loop in detail. And I want to start with the step on design. So when you're doing design, it's worth noting that design doesn't mean, and the iterative loop doesn't mean, build the entire game and then take it through the iterative loop and then build the entire game again. You will use the iterative loop in a lot of very direct and surgical ways. Oftentimes, when you are using the iterative loop, I would encourage you to pick one element of your design to work on. So let's say you're designing a hex encounter war game, about some battle, and you're not sure how large your map should be. Well, you can do basic iteration that just says, I'm going to draw a map, I'm going to have movement factors for my units, I'm going to move them across the map, and then I'm going to see if this map feels like it's the right size for the scale that I'm operating in. You can that's a whole spin or several spins through the iterative loop about one small part of the game. So we sometimes call this building a proof of concept. So when you're working on a game, you will find one element that you want to work on. You need to think about the simplest version of that element that you can possibly think of, and then you go about executing the construction of that element. Now, there are different ways that this can be categorized that I'll get into in further detail later, but if you have built a proof of concept of every single element of your game, sometimes people, especially from the video game world, will call this doing a vertical slice, because you can see every single system that you want your game to do. You can see a small version of it, so you can experience the entire game. Just don't go open up any of the other doors, because there won't be anything behind them. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of doing of what it means to do a proof of concept. Now, there's a lot of art, and it takes a lot of experience to figure out what elements of your game even need built. Like how do you break up a game into smaller parts? Well, it depends on the project, and this is something that I encourage you to discuss with each other and with your mentors. And if you have specific things that you want to sort out, we can talk about them at the end of this chat. I'm happy to help talk about how to divide up tricky games. One critical thing that you need to do when you're dividing this is you might have trouble dividing your game because everything seems so connected. When that happens, you can still take a small section of the game, but for the parts that you're not doing the proof of concept with, you just have to make approximations, right? So you'll say, okay, I don't know. So for example, let's say we were making, I'm going to keep using war game examples because I happen to be working on a war game right now. If I'm making a war game and I don't have a combat system yet, I'll just say, oh, my units are always going to be like losing some health. Just in the background, they're always just losing health. I don't really care how much health they're losing or why, but I just need to show friction. You just need to put a little bit of friction in the system. That's true for an economic game too, right? You could imagine like the idea is as you go through an economic game, as your business gets bigger, maybe there's higher overhead. So if you're proof of concepting a small part of the game, you could say, oh, well, let's just have it so every turn I owe more taxes. And that's kind of generating that. When you're doing proof of concepting, you're really often worried about just two things. These are the most important things to be watching for early in design. And those things are tension and flow. So tension means, is the game generating an interesting decision space? Are the different elements that I want to be putting pressure on the player, are they actually putting pressure? Or, and this is the key thing to watch for, does it feel like my decisions don't matter? If players express, or if you feel that your decisions don't matter, what happens is usually a whole game will start kind of unspooling unless the fact that a player's decisions don't matter is in fact the central element of the game, which is a different issue entirely. But for most games, if players are finding that they can't engage with the game space in any sort of meaningful way, they'll start to disengage. So that's what I mean by tension. The second thing is flow. Now, flow has to do with the how players, and this is one of the hardest things to do as a designer, how easily do players internalize the core logic of the game? So one important part of games is that we have to provide space for other people to witness our moves, and we need to be able to witness the moves of others. That's how games do their narrative storytelling, just fundamentally. We have to witness each other. In order for us to witness each other, and this is a special problem in asymmetric design, we have to be able to understand what our other players were thinking and what kind of pressures they were under when they take a move. In order for us to do that, we have to internalize the core logic of the game, so that if we're sitting down and playing a game of checkers, we're not thinking about the rules of checkers so much as we're thinking about how to outfox the opponent. Maybe chess is a better example of that. You stop thinking about the individual rules about what governs the rules of a rook or a knight in chess, and instead how you're going to pin a player in a corner, or set up a trap of some kind. So flow is very important, and you can usually gauge flow by how many times you are forgetting rules. If you're in a playtest, how many times are players asking questions? What kinds of questions are they asking? How many steps are in a turn? It's one of the most important elements of design that's really easy to forget. It's easy to build a process that has a lot of steps, and to think that it's covering all the externalities. It's going to nicely round out, all the different things you want your game to do. But if players are having to look up a chart every time they need to resolve a phase, it's not allowing a lot of flow to be generated. Now, there's a sliding scale at work here too, which I should mention. If you're working on a more complex design, you can get away with more complex processes. But if you're working on a simple design that is aimed at a general audience, you need to keep that stuff low. And so I'll give you a basic rule. A mid-weight game usually gives players access to 4 primary actions. Not more, not less. And as you get a little bit heavier, you get a few more actions, and as you get a bit lighter, you might find yourself with 2 actions, or sometimes 1 action. And so just deciding which parts of the rules sit in which actions is an interesting kind of challenge for how you're shuffling around complexity. Now, I'll mention here that as you're working on this, so I mentioned we've got one document. That's our design journal. That's an important document. That's where we write Dear Diary every night. That's where we hash out our feelings. The other document is the working rules document. Now, the working rules document is very important. I encourage designers to write rules early and often. And I usually tell folks, do not version your games. It's a huge waste of time. I cannot emphasize that enough. The reason you version things is because sometimes you have to, if this is our little tree of game possibilities and we're out here, sometimes we got to go backwards and decide we want to go a different path. That almost never happens in game development. You go out on a branch and you say, my gosh, this branch is better than the place we used to be, and then you keep going out. So instead, use one living rules document. That document exists for two reasons. First, it is lifting a burden off of your mind. You don't have to hold these rules in your head any longer. You've been blessed with the ability to write. Just put them on the page. The second reason why a rules document is important is because a rules document forces you to write rules. And writing rules is hard. But writing rules is not that different from the process of design. Design is fundamentally about building a syntax, a kind of grammar. You have to figure out what are the grammatical rules of your game, and then you have to populate that game with different kinds of nouns and verbs, which are actions and objects the player is going to be experiencing. That's a lot like what it means to write. And so if you find yourself struggling when you are writing down a rule, and by struggling, I mean having a difficult time expressing the rule, even at the level of grammar. If you find one of your sentences has one too many dependent clauses, what's probably happening is that the rule you are trying to write is too complex. So force yourself when you're writing rules to use short sentences, direct, active voice when possible, because those are going to force you to clearly state what your game is actually forcing or asking the players to do to maneuver through it. So don't worry about writing rules to make it easy for other players to learn the game. These are dev rules. These rules are just for you. Don't confuse them with an actual rule book that you would ever give to anybody else. This is a document to capture the full state of the rules, to help you remember it, and to force you to articulate things in the design. So when I talk about design, that first stage, that's what I'm talking about. Now, some notable things I haven't mentioned about the design stage. Components. And that's because, in general, do not spend time working on components until your game has stabilized. The more time you spend designing a card layout, that is time you could be spending testing the game, writing the rules, thinking about the design. All that stuff is important. It all matters, but it will come later. So I would say, until you've been through the iterative loop a half dozen times, playing with the simplest components you possibly can is going to be an asset. And I'll just kind of plug here. I'll be doing another talk probably in a couple weeks that will be about using graphic design and game design, and I will I'll do a lot of screen sharing and show folks how I use the Adobe Suite and some general graphic design principles to build my workflow. Because after you have done some design work, and some of you are probably here already, it does make sense to start doing the work of building game graphics. The thing that I'll just kind of preview from that talk is that when you're building game graphics, iterative speed, that is the speed of iteration, is everything. It is no use building a beautiful looking graphics suite if you cannot easily change the game. And so you don't want to accidentally design yourself into a corner because it becomes so difficult to change a card frame or to redraw a map. That's and I'll say just as a matter of interest, the biggest warning flag that comes up to me when young designers pitch to me at conventions is when they have the art already done. Because it usually shows that they got very excited, they spent $500 having a beautiful map commissioned, but then they thought their game was done, and they might be years from being done. And that's not, people can waste their money on whatever they'd like. The problem is, as designers then, it compromises their method because they don't want to iterate on something that is hard to iterate. So you're creating a natural barrier where there shouldn't be any barrier at all. Okay, so that's step one. Those are just tips for design. Let's talk about thing two, playtesting. Playtesting is tough. A good playtester is the most valuable commodity in game design. They're like gold. They're if you've all participated in playtesters, thank you for being the engine that makes the whole hobby work. But playtesters also, as valuable as they always come with expiration dates. I usually plan on getting 3 to 5 games max from my playtesters, the most experienced ones. I would almost never ask a player to play a game more times than that unless they were a professional. Generally, I would encourage you not to ambush your friends. Do not compromise your lovely game groups with your desires to design. My general course when I was first starting out is I would offer people a meal and say, hey, this isn't game night. This is a playtesting night. I will make you a beautiful dinner, and then we will playtest as a little thank you. I also found it very helpful to coordinate with other people who are designing and to trade playtests. So people in a mentorship pod can playtest each other's games. In fact, it's incredibly useful because you get to see the work that other folks are doing. You can see the speed at which they're doing the work. And it can be a useful way to hold each other accountable. So I would strongly encourage that. The biggest thing about playtesting that I want to say, though, is that there are 2 very common misconceptions. One is that you need other players to playtest. You do not. You can playtest by yourself. You are not going to be as effective as 4 people. If you're playing a 4-player game and you're one player who's going through all the player positions, you are not going to be as effective. It's going to be slow, and it's going to probably give you a little bit of a headache. But it is so much better for you to playtest in any way than to not playtest. Also recognize that if you're playing a game, there are lots of if you're playing a game by yourself, there are lots of little tricks you can employ, and I'll give you a really silly one. Whenever I am doing a playtest, I will take a little box like this little box. This is actually the one I use. It's a box of business cards. And I just set it to whatever the active play position is. And I force myself to move it around the table. And this seems so silly. But I have to do it because otherwise I know that I will get distracted. There'll be a bird outside that I'll want to go watch instead of testing because nobody is holding me socially accountable. Another system that is really useful when you're playtesting alone is to... if you're playing a game that has cards, it's very easy to only look at like half of your hand so that you have some uncertainty about what the other half of the cards is if you're playing a multi-handed game. Or potentially if you have a hand of cards, to just reveal the top card and force yourself to play it so you have no idea what your own hand is or what your opponent's hand is. Now, obviously, these are imperfect methods for testing, but the goal is to get your bike around the lap. You don't need a perfect playtest. You need to test the basic concepts. And you can learn so much about flow and tension by just forcing yourself to play the game even if you're alone. Now, the second misconception about playtesting is that you have to finish a game. You do not. Oftentimes, so I'm broadcasting to you all from my day job at Leader Games, and we're all professionals here. We've made lots of games together. And I sat down to play the new Root factions about a week ago. We played for 15 minutes. We played 2 turns. And we said, oh, great play test, got a lot to work on, stop. And then they went and worked for a few hours, and then we gathered together and we played for another 15 minutes. And then they went and worked for a couple hours. This is fine. This is a totally normal, reasonable thing. In fact, there is so little value to doing full playtests. I think sometimes when people get to playtesting, especially in the early stages of the process, they want to gather tons of data. They want to record data about the scores. They want to know about the seating order. They want to know how long it took. They want to bring a little questionnaire that says, how much fun did you have? And you have to circle here if you like me. This is a waste of time. In an early stage of a game, the only thing that you're testing for is whatever goal that you laid out. And that's my last main point I want to make about playtesting. When you start playtesting, you should always have an objective in mind and say, okay, I rebuilt my turn order because I wanted player turns to be faster because they were taking too long. So that's the thing, and I'm playtesting to make sure that player turns are faster. And then I play a few turns and, yep, looks like they're faster. Now I can work on a different part of the design, and that's it. So always have specific goals that you have in mind when it comes to playtesting. And like a good scientist, keep those goals simple, small, testable. Don't juggle all your control variables. You need to just be looking at a couple core things for each time around the track. Okay. So The last thing I'll mention. Oh, sorry, this is a very small thing, but it might matter to some of you. When you think about the rhythm of your design development, so like we've talked about the iterative loop, but we haven't talked about how that iterative loop sits on top of our lives. We're all busy, we have lots of obligations. I would encourage you, whatever your work cycle is, you should be playtesting towards the beginning of the work cycle. So let's imagine you have a little bit, maybe you do all of your design, all of your Zenobia time is Saturday and Sunday. You spend your weekends working on it whenever you have a work weekend. If that's the case, you should try to be playtesting towards the beginning of Saturday, because you want time to digest and to think about it and then design. And then the last thing you do is kind of like prepare your kit for the next day. So when we work internally at Leader Games, we do almost all of our playtesting on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. And then we spend Thursday, Friday, and the early part of Monday synthesizing feedback, incorporating it into the design, building the next set of kits so that next Tuesday we're ready to go. And it took us a long time to realize this. We used to do a lot of our playtesting on Thursdays and Fridays because playtesting can be fun. So we thought, oh, it should be towards the end of the week. But it was horrible because what would happen is we would have all these great ideas and then the week would be over and we wouldn't be able to actually act on them. So think about your own habits and your own patterns and try to shift your iterative loop so that the playtesting is happening in an area where you're going to have a lot of time to react to it. Because in fact, the hardest step of the whole iterative cycle is the next step, which is analysis, which is reacting to the game that you just played. So I'll talk a little bit about this from a few different, angles. The first angle is thinking about what you see and feel and how to think about what's wrong in the game. And I want to just start with a premise. And that premise is we understand as designers very little about our games and about how they work. Consider that the ancient dice games from antiquity were made long before the advent of probability studies. We don't really know the things that we're working on. We can think that we know them, but we often don't really fully understand them. And when I talk to really established designers who have had huge breakaway hits that have sold millions of copies, one of the common things that they will tell me is that they are surprised the game did well. They didn't really realize that it was going to resonate with an audience. So I want us to start from that premise, that we are working, when we're doing analysis on a game, we are trying to understand something that is kind of at the edge of our cognition. So how do you understand something that you don't really understand? Well, the key thing is to, one, recognize your ignorance when possible. And the second thing is to understand the value of stating the question. What is really going on? What's really happening here? How can we understand what happened in that specific game? And spending some time just sort of building the terms that you need to talk through a design. I just got done with a playtesting session, and someone at the company who's worked here for a long time told me at the end of it that there were just terms that people were using that they had never applied before. And we were using, and specifically the term fragile. We were talking about a specific mechanism feeling fragile, and it was in the context of a little zero-sum economy part of the game. But they said, I had never used the word fragile when it came to analyzing a player position, and that was a really useful tool. So be on the hunt for words that feel like they give you a wider understanding of what's happening in the game. When you are playtesting a game, remember as the designer, you're the one who wrote the concept document. You're also the one who wrote the guiding lights. So what you see and think and feel is important. So if you sit down to play your game and you're like, this is boring. Good. Underline that. This is boring. This is that is coming from you as the primary and best judge of your own work. And so I want you to elevate your own sensibility, because part of what being a designer is developing a really keen sense of taste and having strong opinions opinions that are so strong they are encouraging you to participate in the act of creation. So don't mute those things. And tomorrow you may look at your notes and be like, wow, I was in a bad mood. That happens too. So don't allow yourself a little bit of grace too. Okay, so now let's talk about playtesting with other people. There's a rule, and this is a rule from a designer named Tom Lehman. Tom Lehman designed a lot of games, most famously Race for the Galaxy. And Tom has a rule about playtesting, which I love, which is that he doesn't say anything. He actually never participates in his own playtest. He just observes, and he watches the playtesters, and he takes tons of notes. And he told me once that playtesters are the best thing to watch while they're playing the game. They have amazing opinions while they're playing the game. And then as soon as the game's over, the things they say become less and less valuable every single minute. Now, why does this happen? Well, it happens for a few reasons. So one, as a rule, playtesters tend to be really good at stating a problem, especially something that doesn't feel right, and they tend to be less good at figuring out the solution. And that's because they are not as deeply in tuned with all of the core elements of the game as the design team is. So that's one reason. The other reason why is that if you think about a classroom discussion, part of the fun of a classroom discussion is participating in that discussion. And so what will happen after a playtest is the playtesters will find themselves enjoying talking about the game because it's fun to talk about anything. And so the conversation will start to like magnify parts of the design that actually aren't in trouble and also minimize parts that really are in trouble because maybe they're a little less fun to talk about. So the main thing as an observer or as an observer participant when you're the playtest lead is to modulate that feedback. First of all, don't take it personally. They're not talking about you. They're talking about your game. But as important to that is the notion that you need to be paying attention to the player, what the players do and what they say, but don't worry too much about their solutions. They're not going to be the ones who are going to fix the design. And they might have a lot of good ideas. And that's a hard thing to tell, like, especially if you're playing the other people in your Zenobia pods games. Everyone's a designer. Everybody wants to help, but you have to really pull it back. And instead, I would encourage you, whenever you are finding yourself as a playtester, to not try to fix someone else's design, but instead help them state the problem. Now, I try not to look for easy laughs or like fun moments when we're doing playtesting. Instead, the thing that I'm usually hunting for, that I want, that's like powering me up, is engagement. I want to see players playing the game. I want to see them at play. I don't want to see them just like laughing. Even if I'm working on a party game, I would rather see players who seem like they're grappling with something, because that engagement is usually a sign that you're doing something right. Now, I mentioned earlier that you shouldn't try to get too much information or analytics from any playtest. There are exceptions to that. Late stage playtests, you actually might need to really pay attention to the numbers, because in an iterative loop cycle, you might find yourself saying, boy, it seems like the first player is always winning, or that there's a turn order bias in this game. And so then you can playtest for just that specific thing. But the thing that I'm often interested in more than data is the quality of the conversation around your game. So when you listen to people as they're playing it, talking about the game and talking about their moves and counter moves, oftentimes the quality of that conversation can tell you what parts of the game are working and what parts of the game aren't working. Now, after a playtest, one of the most important things you can do is you can try to state some concerns that you have that are then going to inform your next time around the iterative loop. And I always try to encourage folks to put their concerns in a kind of separate, not separate document, but in like a special place that is like maybe like at the top of the rules or the bottom of the rules, and just say like, I'm worried that if you build ranches, you become too powerful in this game. Or like, if you, all of your subjects are so different from each other, it's really hard to find common design points. In a wargaming conference, I can just talk about Sherman tanks or something, and everybody knows what I'm talking about. But the main thing is recognizing, like having a space for you to say concerns. And the key thing here is to separate the statement of concerns from the proposal of possible solutions. Because one thing that will happen, and I just want to flag this, is when you are writing a concern, you'll say, I'm a little worried that if someone invests in textile dyes, they're going to become a runaway leader. And then as you're writing that sentence, the designer in you starts bubbling up and wants to say, and so I'm going to make textiles cost more money. It's like, stop. Take that proposal and put it in another place, because the statement of concern should be something that you can use to judge a playtest on or judge a design on. You don't want to be commingling it with a proposal. Now, the last stage of this whole an analyze step is the formulation of a proposal, and that proposal will guide you in the next design wave. So you might say at the end of your playtest, okay, all this is going good. So a successful proposal, a successful playtest might yield a result that says, okay, for my next step, I'm going to start building out the railroad framework for the game, and I'm going to propose these things, and these are my main elements that I'm going to go on, and then we'll start to design for that. So when you go to the design step, you should always be able to look back and find a prompt that's going to guide you through that next step. And that kind of brings me to the last little thing that I want to say, which is design is exhausting. There's no getting around it. It is like actually a Sisyphean task. Like I like the iterative loop because I like Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus. And the important part is when when Sisyphus turns back and decides that he's going to climb back up the hill, right? And so likewise, it's the moment right after you finished a lap where you decide like, yeah, I'm going to hit another lap. The way that you can make that process easier is by whenever you finish one step of the iterative loop, make sure you build yourself a little hook that's going to help you pull through the next one. So you've just finished, you're analyzing your playtest. So you write a proposal, you start design. What's the first thing you do? You look at the proposal you just wrote. Great. Then you finish your design, you create a playtest goal. Now you go into playtesting. You're looking at the playtest goal to decide what you should be looking for. And on that note, I'm happy to say you have a concept proposal. You have, in fact, the first great proposal that will animate this whole cycle if it hasn't already animated it, which is now you can go into the design step knowing what you're doing. Of course, many of your proposals are going to be very long and complex because you're working on lovely, long, and complex projects. So you pick a smaller part and you get right to it. Now, hopefully you can see, as I've arranged all these things, the value of a good project journal. I use project journals for everything I work on. And I will say, I'm a horrible diarist. Every journal that my parents bought me as a kid never made it past like page 3. But if I have an animating project and I just say, look, every few days I'm going to like mark a date and then just write what I worked on, and then use your journal as a place to record your progress, and also all your misgivings. Game design's hard. It's good to have a place to sort those things out. But also treat your journals like scrap paper, like commonplace books. I have pages of the ARCS journals that are just lists of graphic design things I have to do. That's fine. It's just paper. It's just digital space. But it can be a place where you can see forward progress even when you can't see it elsewhere. One of the hardest things about working on a game is that you don't often have like a single thing that you can point to as the thing you made. You might have some rules in your head and some cards you designed, but that doesn't really show the progress, especially a rule book. Because that rule book, it might be like a few thousand words, and you might be constantly rewriting it and rewriting it. It can be exhausting, and it can feel, futile. Because if you're writing a book, you would be a dozen chapters in, but because it's a rule book, it's like you're writing one chapter forever. The project journal allows you to fulfill that baser desire to just build something like a house, when in fact, it's actually a journal about how you're getting around the racetrack. Okay, so that's it. That's all I've got to say about that stuff. I'm happy to take questions. Just in case there are problems with audio, I'll probably restate the question. So, that's that. And I'm happy to take questions for, 15 minutes or so. Hear out your projects, anything you'd like.
Hi,
All right,
can you
hello.
hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you, Cole, for the distilled wisdom. Um, so in Zenobia, we are working on games that are historical, right? So one of my concerns with the first play test is that I feel that tester is getting enamored with the abstraction of the mechanism,
Hmm.
but no relationship to the historical theme or setting. And so um, I might get it to a wonderful game that is engaging, hopefully, but at the end result, I don't see how it's gonna enact some thinking or something about the history that we want to express in this experience.
Hmm.
So how do you deal with that, or is that to be expected? And
It
or
is
maybe
so
or maybe
nor
like some players are gonna be like that forever, and you cannot control that. I don't know. That's
it
my question. Thank you.
it is so normal. There's a comment you see sometimes from people who work in film where something doesn't totally work until the last moment, and so there's this moment of tension where you're sort of holding the whole project in your head, and then you have to do that all the way basically to the first screening, and then when you let it out, it fully realizes it. History games can be that way. So I mean, I often think about my history games as works more of historical fiction than of simulation. This is a matter of personal taste and a design aesthetic, but it's very common when I'm working on a game for players to not feel engaged. And I'll give a couple examples, both of which had different solutions. So in Molly House, which I've been working on with Joe Kelly, a former Zenobia game, um, we the game is quite abstract, and it we kept getting a response from playtesters that felt like it wasn't historical. It didn't have any historical grounding, and I was like, these people are crazy because this game is so historical, but it is abstract. It's like listening to a piece of music and you don't know that it's actually about a Greek myth or something, and then once you see it, you see it everywhere. The moment we got art on it, and actually even before we got art, what we did is I went to the map and I just made it so I put in all the historical place names. So instead of just a street in a market, it was Lincoln Inn's Bog House, it was Newgate Market. And as soon as players started using just the place names of London, the whole game kind of opened up and they were transported. So a similar kind of example comes from Pamir. When I was first working on Pamir, I kept hearing players tell me it didn't feel transporting, and I couldn't figure out what was wrong. And there were two things. One, the subject of 1820s Afghanistan is not something a lot of people know about, so they didn't have any potted narratives. And if a player doesn't know anything about the history, they're not going to feel transported from on a prototype because they don't have any media in their mind to fill. And so I was like, okay, well, I'll give them names. And so I went through all the Premiere cards and early prototype and I put in all the names. Now, the names didn't do any good because most of my playtesters had never been exposed to a deep cast from Central Asia. There are many characters named Muhammad, for instance. And so that wasn't doing it for them. And in fact, there was a kind of weird orientalization thing happening where they would see a long name of a Persian emperor and they would just say like, well, that's just a bunch of letters and apostrophes. And they weren't really giving themselves time to do that. So what I actually did is I went through and I looked for a kind of precise language to describe like, oh, this isn't the Ark of Bukhara, it's the fortress of Bukhara. And so like the word fortress is giving someone who doesn't know the area something to hold on to. And so I think sometimes when you're working on historical games, it's helpful to think like a historical novelist and to really attend the language. So the very basic question I would ask you are, look at the names of your actions. Because if your actions are things like play, pass, you're going to have a hard time describing it. Now, there's a limit here too, right? So if you know the old game Netrunner, they went very hard into like, okay, they're not called action points, they're called clicks. And like you can become a self parody if you go too far in one direction. But I think in lieu of art, really attend to language and it might help it. But generally, this is super common. Do not worry too much about the history. Worry about the flow, the tension, and the core model. And then at the same time, have the list of moments of things the historical moments you want to recreate. If your game is not recreating them, then you need to expand your model so that it can hold them. That's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hello, hello.
Um, Thank you, of course, for all the explanation of the design process. But I was thinking of a problem of I'm having for like a week or something after I started actually prototyping. Is where does the research step fall into this whole iteration process? Because I got like the pressure of deadlines. I need to start working on the prototype and finish it, etc. But the more I put rules around or write drafts for rules or actually making cards, I ask myself questions like, oh, what was that actual thing that happened back in the day? And I go back to my research, and I start reading, and then we're like, oh, I didn't read about this enough to
Hmm.
actually like write rules about it. So I kind of was stuck. Like, should I like finish all of the research before doing the iterations, or is it something that falls within this loop?
That's a great question. I I would say that for my own process, research is unhooked from the iterative process. I'm just kind of I usually do a big portion of the research before I even really start designing the game. And then once I'm designing the game, I do a little bit of research, and then that research amps up when I'm doing content creation. So actually, one thing that is really outside the loop itself is the generation of content. And I know content is in the context of like a content creator is sort of like a dirty word because it sort of hollows out things. But in games, it's not. It's just a brick. Like you need bricks to build your house. And so when you're doing content design, usually there's a lot of research that goes into that. And that could say like, look, you need to know a lot about palace intrigue, and like the I don't know, Minoan, the ancient Minoa. Well, you're going to be spending some time reading some books and making lists of kings and queens and what we might know about them. That process can kind of happen um, when you get to the point of the game when you actually need to flesh out the content. Now, you mentioned something interesting, which is it's quite possible that when you're designing something, you run into a realization that you might have been wrong about something, or you might have not given something adequate weight. That is okay. What I would say generally is that it's important to recognize that games reflect a certain understanding of something, not the only understanding of something. So I feel comfortable starting the design process the moment I feel like I have an understanding of something that is adequately informed to communicate or capture, right? So in the context of teaching, just because I used to teach a lot, if I felt like I felt comfortable giving a kind of 101 lecture on the subject of the fall of the Durrani Empire and the birth of modern Afghanistan, then I would say, okay, I can explain this to a bunch of undergrads. I have a sufficient understanding that I feel comfortable building a small game about the subject. Now, am I going to discover things in the process of building that game that are going to radically transform my understanding of the subject? Yes. And in fact, like in the worst case, it can even possibly invalidate the game. And at that point, you have to look at like the thing you just learned in the game you made and decide if they can be reconciled. And know that they might not be able to be reconciled. But just always know that every game you make reflects a certain kind of understanding. You know, in the world of war gamers, people will make a game about the same battle over and over and over again, and you can see them continually learning new things about the same battle, and then making a new articulation of it. Because and here, I mean, I'm sounding so down on this, but actually, what you know about your subject right now is likely valuable and worth communicating. You don't need to be an authoritative source on this. You could just say, look, this is a complex subject. I'm highlighting one element of that subject. I mean, most of your games are about subjects that people have devoted their entire academic careers to understanding. So don't expect that you need to capture every element when you run. In fact, sometimes design is easier when you know like only a sliver of something. As long as that sliver is, true and interesting and kind of compelling to yourself. All right. Anyone else? I could do a couple more. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Cole.
Hello.
Thank you so much for the session. Really appreciate it. Uh, Thank you for the other questions the other people asked. It answers a lot of my worries also. So I've been in this limbo. Like my game has marinated for a couple of years before the Zenobia award came in. So I'm picking it up again, making sure it sees the light of the day. Uh, so here, when I'm trying to fit the historical aspect of this economic history of things, a progression of time within the game, policy cards, like how did the policies affect what was happening in India back then in the coffee estates? So could that be how little is too little and how much is too much of historical information being packed into a game which focuses on history is going to be my
Okay,
question. What?
that's a great question, and I've like I'll move us to another room with a whiteboard, and we can have a whole talk about that specific question because it is such a good and present question for everyone. So, historical games are. So here's why I like using historical fiction, because if we think about historical games as history books, we run into the problem that you've described so eloquently, which is that you can't capture everything. And so it feels like you're leaving just dozens and dozens of things off, and suddenly everything starts warping. But instead, if we think about historical fiction, it fundamentally becomes about telling a story. And the way stories work is they're usually grounded in perspective. And so what I usually like to do is say, okay, my my player positions are, these folks, and what did they care about, worry about, and think about? It doesn't need to be everything, but I need to constantly go back to asking myself, who are my players? What sorts of things do they have control over, and do they worry about? And if I can use that lens, it helps sort out a lot of this stuff. So that's kind of like answer one. Answer two is to note that historical games are filled to the brim with little lies. And I'll give you an example from John Company, my game about India, because I had a very interesting problem when I was working on that game that actually is very close to what you described. So John Company I knew I wanted to have a parliament phase. I wanted to have laws because the actions of the British Parliament had huge consequences on the Indian subcontinent. The problem is, historically, all of the actions of Parliament basically can be grouped into three huge omnibus laws. That is like a law that has a lot of little laws that are packaged into it. Now that's horrible from a game design perspective because it says like, okay, don't care about Parliament, don't care about Parliament. Okay, there's one law, it's going to change the game in like 10 ways and you have to vote on it. So what I did is I took those laws and I said, okay, in game terms, I'm going to take these three large India acts, they were called. I'm going to divide them into little pieces. And now I'm going to just spread them throughout the entire game. And so they happen in small pieces, they're voted on, and no single law in John Company really directly corresponds to any real law in the real world. It's a fiction. But what it does is it asks the players to consider how political power might be leveraged to their advantage or not advantage. And so, again, you always want to back out and just ask yourself about the perspective of the players. Because this is why I get so passionate about like questions of immersion in games, because I feel like that's the thing that is making the game feel grounded. And you can use that just as a way of grounding your own design practice. But it's a great question, but like without an easy answer, unfortunately.
Thank you so much.
Of
I
course.
mean, I was grappling with this whole thing of being authentic, being shot down by people who will be helping me with the research part of it, not representing it. But then again, reminding myself that it's a game and the whole idea about keeping the tension and being in the flow, like the player should feel the flow. So I think I keep zooming in and out of it. But this really, really does help. I'm not
Yeah.
going to pressurize myself too much
Okay,
under
good.
the thing.
And
Yeah.
if you have the good fortune to be working with any kind of scholar or expert, know that they will always want more. And you have to tell them like, we are designing a kids program. You know, I mean, you just have to say like, this is
Yeah.
imagine you had to boil the subject down into a 5-minute sketch that you're going to perform in front of a bunch of secondary school students, right? I often liken historical games, even the really detailed ones, to like Punch and Judy, like little puppet shows. They just don't have that much detail. They have a tremendous amount of affective detail. They're really good at making players feel things. They are less good about specific communication. And there are designers who disagree. I think this is a matter of personal aesthetic judgment. And so you're welcome to disagree with there. But I just have, like, that has been the element of my own practice that I've found kind of resonates. Okay, I think there was one other person who had a question at the same time you did.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah,
First,
this is the last
thank you very
one.
much for. Okay, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and everyone for the questions. I'm working on a historical war game, and I'm having some troubles to incorporate social, cultural, and political elements. Like the main focus of the game is being the war, but it's difficult for me to add all the other aspects without falling in just names or flavor text. Do you have any tips to incorporate these elements in a more organic way?
Yeah, so this is a really hard problem, which is basically, you're working on a war game. Like it's concerned with the movement of forces on a map, the projection of force. Where does the social and cultural factor in? So I'll give you a couple examples of how it is sometimes done. So one consideration is when you're putting anything into your design, you have to decide if that element of your design is a location of friction. Is it just going to present friction? Players have to deal with the fact that it's raining. Or is it an arena? Is it a place that players can express agency and compete? And I think thinking about all of the parts of your game as is this a site of friction or an arena, it can be a helpful sorting system, especially when thinking about social pressure. So, for example, in a war game, I'll use I'll use a kind of hot button issue. I'll think about a World War II game in the presence of the Holocaust. So the Holocaust has very little presence in a lot of World War II games, and that's because I think there's a lot of reasons for it, but I think many designers have decided that it was a friction that we can represent in abstract ways, but it wasn't like an arena where the players actually had agency. Or if we did give players agency, they would behave in ways that would be non-historical, which is, I think, a reasonable judgment, one that can be disagreed with, but also reasonable. So now, when it comes to, let's just think about how those two things are different then. If it's an arena, you have to build some kind of mechanical apparatus to influence it. And here I'm thinking about, I'll use in the context of wargaming, Mark Herman's Washington's War, where players are putting down political points to play an area majority game that's like loosely based on Go, where they're fighting for control of the 13 colonies with this, area majority game. And then they're fighting a war game on top of the area majority game, right? Or to use Ed Beach's Here I Stand, all the control pieces in Here I Stand, which is the game of the Protestant Reformation, have a Protestant side and a Catholic side. And so you have 4 political powers who are fighting a war game and 2 religious powers who are just trying to flip those little pieces over to turn a thing into Protestant or Catholic. So in both cases, the designer said the religious sphere in Here I Stand and the political sphere in Washington's War, those are arenas. I'm building a whole mechanical framework that allows us to handle the arena. Now, your game, depending on where the rules are spent and its subject, may not be able to support adding a whole other mechanical system on top of everything. And so in that case, you can think about tools of friction. And tools of friction could be things like event systems, random event systems that generate some of that friction. Or the most common tool, which is easy to forget, is victory conditions. So I'll give you an example. Imagine you're playing a war game where there is some kind of social uprising that is happening in one of the players' capitals. So you're like, okay, this player red, they've got a capital. Or we'll use World War I as an example. So World War I, one player's the Russians, and they have to deal with this social upheaval. Except, I don't have any rules to spend on the bullshit, like on the Decembrists and the Bolshevik uprising. There's no rules left. We can't do all that. So instead, I'll say the Russians have to win in 5 turns. And if they don't win in 5 turns, they lose. And why did they lose? Because of the Bolshevik Revolution. And so I think thinking about kind of simple sites of friction can be a place where you can put in some of that cultural framework and social framework, but be really clear about what you want to turn into an arena and what you don't. And if you are going to turn something into an arena, that's great. Just know it costs rules. It costs complexity. And if that's the main part of the story, I'll just underline this. If that's the main part of the story, then it should cost rules. It's okay. In fact, my favorite, it's crazy I'm talking so much about the Second World War. My favorite World War II game, and I don't have many because I don't really like that subject that much, is a game called Triumph and Tragedy. And it works so well because it balances a political and social dynamic with a military dynamic. And you can see in the evolution of the design that all these rules were spent on the war game. But at a certain point, the war game couldn't get any more complex because the designer, Craig Brusink, needed to spend a lot more time on the social and political element, which ends up being as interesting or more interesting. Cool. Excellent, excellent question. If you ask questions in chat, I would love to see them, but if I open it, it will mess up my stream. So I will respond to questions after the stream's over, and I'll be around. But thank you so much for coming. We will be posting this up on our YouTube, and I think in a couple weeks, I will be doing a kind of graphic design process talk. And then after that, we got all kinds of interesting talks, and we'll hopefully have a big schedule that we can post later. But thanks again, everybody, for coming. Hope you have a wonderful day, and good luck on your designs.